You're in for a treat. This past spring, the Kennedy School awarded Andrea Mitchell its Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism. She delivered a splendid 30-minute talk, followed by a lively 30-minute question and answer period. And tonight, the Cambridge Forum is going to do the Kennedy School 15 minutes better. This is a 75-minute session. Andrea Mitchell, as you know, has been at the center of the national reporting scene since the 1970s, a remarkable achievement, and doubly so given the barriers to entry to women journalists at the time that she came into the business. She has covered every president since Jimmy Carter and has reported on most of the great stories of the past 3 decades, from the Iranian hostage crisis of the late 1970s to today's conflict in Iraq. During this time, among her many distinctions, is one that may never be equaled. In 1988, she broke the story that George H.W. Bush had chosen Dan Quayle as his running mate. In 2004, she broke the story that John Kerry had chosen John Edwards as his running mate. No reporter has ever done it twice. Since 1994, as Pat said, Andrea Mitchell has been NBC's chief foreign affairs correspondent. The world is her beat. Before that, she was NBC's chief congressional correspondent, and she also spent time as NBC's chief White House correspondent. And she has made headlines as well as covered newsmakers. Recently, she sparked a diplomatic fury when she was dragged away by Sudanese security guards after asking Sudan's president why the United States should believe that the Sudanese government will stop the killing in Darfur when it continues to support the militia who are doing the killing. And it took Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and a lot of work to get an apology from the Sudanese government. The tough, penetrating question that she asked then has long been Andrea Mitchell's trademark, and we're delighted that she's here at the Cambridge Forum to share with us her thoughts based on her new book, Talking Back. Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you so very much. I am honored, first of all, flattered to be here tonight. So happy to be in Cambridge, and incredibly honored to have Tom Patterson moderating this forum, who is one of the keenest observers of our media, observers, critics, and analysts of our media. So I welcome the opportunity for some tough questioning tonight. What I've tried to do in Talking Back is ask some tough questions about our own work, and I can't think of a better time in American history than to ask questions about our news media. What kind of job are we doing? How well have we served the American people, both in political campaigns, in our coverage of elections, and I've been fortunate enough to cover elections, national campaigns going back all the way to 1972, and more recently our coverage of the more complicated issues of international terrorism and intelligence gathering, the events leading to 2001, the events leading to the Iraq War. So those are some of the reasons why I decided to write this book at this time, having no idea just how challenging it would be, and thinking that the Iraq War would have been over, that it would have been a quiet time in American politics and governance, and that I could, in my spare time from NBC, sit down and write a book. And as all of you who have written or aspire to write know, it is far more difficult than any of us might imagine. First of all, none of the political or global events conspired to make it any easier, because the Iraq War continues and our politics are even more contentious and challenging than I had ever imagined they would be. And the news media's role is far more controversial, including my own. So as I started looking back, I realized that I had to take it all the way back to my first broadcast as an 11-year-old in the 6th grade in a wonderful public elementary school in suburban New York City, where I competed to be the one who would say, "Good morning, boys and girls. This is Andrea Mitchell from the principal's office." And even though I thought I wanted to be a violinist or an English professor and never had any conception that I would be a journalist, I started early writing and competing and won the, quote, job as the school reporter for my public school to once a week file a weekly compendium of the activities in our school for the hometown paper. And my mother would drive me down to Main Street, and I'd walk into this newsroom dark. In my imagination now, it was right out of Ben Hecht's Front Page, and there was one woman editor, Miss Virginia Clare. And fortunately, she likes the book. I was nervous that she wouldn't, because I have such sharp memories of being nervous every time I submitted a story. So once a week I would bring my story, and I usually was late on deadline, and she would edit it, and then would be the joy, if it were good enough, to wait for the newspaper to be thrown on the front porch and see my byline. And I guess I got the bug. And then in college radio, where I got involved at the University of Pennsylvania to program classical music, they needed someone to interview Barry Goldwater in 1964. And I thought, how cool was this? I was a college kid interviewing a presidential candidate, filing a report, then participating in combined Ivy League radio network coverage of the Senate races in 1964. So clearly I was destined not to be the professor that I thought I'd be, and tried to get a job in a newsroom. Very tough challenge in 1967. They simply were not hiring women. And what I was told in no uncertain terms was that there was no room for broads in broadcasting. And so I finally talked my way into a job, an entry-level job as a copy boy. There were no copy girls, and worked my way up. And that was the first place, the most, clearly the formative years of journalism for me were going up against a tough former police chief, then mayor, a man named Frank Rizzo. He was as colorful and charismatic and profane and controversial and divisive as a politician could be in a racially divided city. It was the 60s and early 70s, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and he had never before contemplated being questioned by what he called a girl reporter. And as I moved my way up, I discovered just how difficult it could be, and strangely, perhaps armed with the naivete of youth, it never occurred to me to be afraid of him until years later. And only, in fact, after I had left Philadelphia and was already at the network in Washington, did I discover from a former news director at a press club dinner that Frank Rizzo had called the chairman of the board of Westinghouse Broadcasting in Pittsburgh, the owner of our company, on an almost weekly basis to get me fired. And I said, well, why didn't you ever tell me? And the news director said, because we thought it would have a chilling effect on your reporting, which is counterintuitive for people who think that all corporate owners, are bad or interfere. But in fact, I have never found censorship or interference from up above with what I write. I think, if anything, there is a self-censorship in the media, which brings me to the events immediately after 9/11. Our lives all changed in such a profound way, obviously, on September 11th. The summer before that horrific day, I, as the chief foreign affairs correspondent for NBC News, found so little interest in foreign affairs, even though I had been the first network correspondent to report on Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in late 96 and early 97, and then, of course, had covered the attacks on our embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya, and again the attack in October 2000 on the USS Cole. But there was so little sustained interest in foreign policy that in the summer of 2001, I probably filed more stories on the case of a missing Washington intern and her reputed not confirmed relationship or non-relationship with a former member of Congress than anything else. So up until September 10th, the new administration did not have a game plan or a report. It hit the desk of the President on September 10th on what to do about what the outgoing Clinton administration recommended should be the top priority, al-Qaeda. And as the 9/11 Commission report showed, the outgoing Clinton administration left it to the next administration for a number of reasons. Partly, the October attack on the USS Cole was not linked to al-Qaeda until late October, early November. By then, we were catapulted into what could have been a constitutional crisis of the election, the Bush-Gore election, which wasn't decided, of course, for another month. And the Clinton administration decided not to launch military attacks or respond in any way to the attack on the Cole, leaving it to the next administration for a number of reasons, one of which was the White House, the President himself has said he thought that they would be criticized if they launched a military attack during this interregnum when there was no clearly defined president. So whatever interpretation Osama bin Laden placed on that failure to respond, the new administration came in and took their time in deciding how to approach terrorism, and we all saw the results on 9/11. And immediately we were, of course, swept into this post-terror attack atmosphere, which I think in retrospect caused a number of reporters and news organizations to, if you will, suspend disbelief and put too much credibility on what the government was telling us. And as I looked back, in talking back, I've gone back to all of our transcripts during that period where I was covering the discussions, the presentations by Colin Powell to the United Nations Security Council, and have asked myself whether or not we did enough. And the clear answer is we didn't. But the bottom line is we should not mislead ourselves into thinking we're doing any better. The intelligence community is just as opaque as it was back then, if not more so with the reorganization. And we are only as good as our sources. And if our sources are all official sources, then we will be misled, wittingly or unwittingly, and continue to be to this day. The UN inspectors had not been on the ground for 4 years until they got back in. And the conventional wisdom among French, Russian intelligence, Hans Blix at the UN, Rolf Akeis before him at the UN, and surely David Kay, all three of the top weapons inspectors, was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It was conventional wisdom because it made no sense that he didn't. If he didn't have weapons, especially since he had once used them, twice used them in fact, had been farther along on nuclear technology in 1991 after the first Gulf War than anyone had imagined until he was busted by the UN, had developed germ weapons secretly that we only discovered after his two sons-in-law escaped, talked to the CIA, and then, unfortunately for them, returned to Iraq and were promptly executed. So all of these reasons, but most importantly, because Saddam Hussein had foregone $300 billion with a B dollars in oil revenues over more than a decade and had refused to conform to the UN Security Council resolutions by failing to disclose what he had. The assumption was if he didn't have weapons, why didn't he just say he didn't and get rid of the sanctions? The U.S. was already isolated at the Security Council. All of this is to say there was a preponderance of assumptions, false assumption built on false assumption, conventional wisdom, skewing what turned out to be the facts on the ground, and we went along with it. And the real failure, I think, was in the failure of our political process and our journalistic process to talk about what were the options. If you assumed he had weapons, what were the policy choices? Did you go to war? Did you have the inspectors continue on the ground? That is where we really failed the American people, on top of giving too much credibility to the presentation of Colin Powell and others. Powell, in a recent interview with Barbara Walters, his first post-office interview, said that that presentation at the United Nations would forever be a blot on his record of public service, which is quite a concession from a very proud man and someone who went through 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, was Deputy National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So for him to look back with such profound regret, that's as close as a proud general, retired general, will ever come, I think, to a public apology. So I look at all of this and continue to ask myself, how much have we contributed to the misunderstandings? How have the technological changes in my profession contributed to the unpleasant discourse? Why has the Senate become such an unpleasant place that the John Danforths and Pat Moynahans and before that David Boren and others have chosen to leave the Senate rather than continue and chase money as they had to? And I asked David Boren on Meet the Press many years ago. He was then the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, senior Democrat, a moderate Democrat, and I asked him why he was going back to Oklahoma to become president of the university there, and he said he could not stand the money chase, that they were forced to raise $3,000 a day for 6 years in order to get reelected to the Senate, and that's in 1993 or $4, before the system became even more corrupt, if you will. John McCain and Russ Feingold thought that they had cured the problem, only to discover in the 2004 election cycle that it has become even more corrupt with the 527 groups and the loopholes that have been exploited by both parties, frankly, more so by the Democratic and liberal groups initially, and then, of course, most profoundly by the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, as that 527 group was called. So I look in talking back about, I look at how we've covered politics and trace some of the campaigns of the past. The Ronald Reagan campaigns, where it was always morning in America and you never got a chance to question the candidate or the president in 1984, but we traveled across America and every event was like a Norman Rockwell painting. It was a red, white, and blue, white picket fence America, never any diverse audiences, and it was a comforting, reassuring image in 1984, which proved to be an election, partly decided on some of the debates and Reagan's ability once again, after the way he defeated Jimmy Carter in that debate, with "there you go again," Ronald Reagan's ability with one-liners and with television images that captured his reassuring grandfatherly presence to win re-election again in 1984. Well, then we had the problems of Iran-Contra, and I traced that and the pitfalls of second-term presidents. We've seen that now with Reagan and certainly with Bill Clinton, and perhaps some would say with the declining polls, we're seeing similar problems with this presidency as well. I can't think of a better time, as I suggested at the beginning, to be talking about all of this, because there has been, I think, a profound change in the way journalists are covering what has been going on since Hurricane Katrina. And I can tell you, I've never felt more proud of my friends and colleagues down there in all the networks and in print for the passionate, adversarial, aggressive way that they have gone after the truth. I think the difference was that they were, contrary to the way we were forced out of Iraq during that period when the inspectors were also gone and didn't have any ground truth and had no way to independently ascertain whether there were weapons or not. In the Gulf and in New Orleans and in the Mississippi coast, but particularly in Louisiana, we were on the ground before the first responders. We were on the ground when the federal government was not there. Now, that raises a very interesting question. How could we repeatedly get to these locations and they could not? And Brian Williams from our network, from NBC, was in the Superdome that first night and watched and traced with his camera how the roof was opening and the water started to pour in. And then over the course of that week, there was such a disconnect between what Washington was telling us from the official podia and what we were seeing on the ground. And so we were asking questions and perhaps being much more aggressive than we had been in the past, I think appropriately so. And there was a night, 4 days after the storm, when Brian was interviewing the former head of FEMA live, Michael Brown, and asked him why pallets of food and water had not been dropped to the convention center, why food and water had not been pre-positioned to these locations that had been previously announced as the place of last resort. And Michael Brown said, gee, we didn't know about it until today, when it had been broadcast, nonstop for at least 24 hours. And it's that kind of disconnect that I think we've seen before, but not nearly as dramatically. Of course, we can ask ourselves, how could we possibly be first discovering poverty in America in the month of October 2005? Those of us who cut our teeth covering the Great Society and some of the subsequent administrations have to ask ourselves, where have we all been as citizens, as voters, as viewers and readers of the news media, and as journalists? So I found it a little astounding that the news magazines and other of my colleagues, were so shocked that there was poverty in Louisiana and Mississippi, our two poorest states. But the real question is why local, state, and federal officials failed to take care of the most vulnerable people in our society, and how they could have not had a plan. Every single city is supposed to have an evacuation plan on file with FEMA, which is part of Homeland Security. So if we are falsely assured since 9/11 and since the 9/11 Commission that the Homeland Security reorganization and consolidation of departments makes us any safer, I think that this was a pretty big shock to the system. Because even though it is primarily a local responsibility to take care of evacuating people, clearly if there were an evacuation plan on file, which we're told there was, nobody in Washington said, how many school buses have you commissioned? How many Amtrak passenger seats are you utilizing? Perhaps then the mayor would not have 10 days later been on Meet the Press saying to Tim Russert, I didn't know that 900 passenger seats had been offered by Amtrak 24 hours before the storm. And where was the federal government? We now see these successive trips of the president to the Gulf area and these attempts by the White House to show his great concern. But I think that what this has exposed is a real failure of reorganization and a failure of outreach on every level of our governance. So the shock of witnessing all of that did inspire reporters to do the kind of job that, frankly, we should have done before. So that brings me back to the narrative of the book. I try to talk about journalism. I know I will enjoy attempting to respond to your questions on that subject, because it's something that we all care about. And finally, in talking about the role of women and how we work behind the scenes, I think what I've tried to do is share how we create stories, how we respond to emergencies. It does concern me that many of my colleagues have seen and experienced things in the last few weeks that are so horrific they can't even share them with our viewers. And it worries me that they are emotionally and physically drained from the experience. I can relate to that, having gone to Jonestown, Guyana, as one of my first assignments for NBC. And in the many weeks and months after that, we're still coming to grips with what happened, with how I felt going in after our correspondent and camera crew had been murdered on the tarmac by Jim Jones, the cult leader's henchman, to go in as a new correspondent, not even knowing how to find the satellite to feed the videotape, and frankly not doing such a good job. So I've tried to be as honest as I can about my failures and setbacks and being passed over for jobs and then coming back and finally succeeding, and the disappointments of being in this profession. And then I talk about my husband and the life we have led, which has been blessed and privileged. How could a correspondent from a major network be married to the chairman of the Federal Reserve? Well, the short answer is I dated an economist on Wall Street. He was a private business. I was a reporter calling him to ask him about trickle-down economics. And by complete accident and happenstance, he got appointed to the Fed, and we tried to figure out the rules of the road and how to avoid conflicts of interest. And as he likes to say, he proposed 3 times before I even understood what he was saying. So fortunately or unfortunately, I've never been able to overhear any of the secrets of the temple. But it's a fair question. There are obvious appearances of conflict, if not real conflicts, and it's been a fascinating 18 years since he's been at the Fed, trying to navigate those sometimes rough waters. I am, at the end of talking back, still on the front lines. I end the book first in Ramallah, covering Yasser Arafat's funeral, and then with the inauguration of George W. Bush, looking forward and looking back at an extraordinary 4 decades in journalism, what I call a mid-career book. I have seen great changes in the way women have been able to succeed in this profession, but I also would be the first to tell you that we still have many obstacles and barriers yet to overcome. So I wrote the book to reach out to younger journalists, aspiring journalists, and also to those who love history, the history of 5 presidencies that I've covered, been privileged to cover, and also to share some of my continuing concerns about the progress of journalism. I use that word progress in quotation marks, as we try to cover some of the most challenging issues of any generation. With that, I want to thank you all so much for coming and look forward to your questions.
If you do have a question, we do have the microphone set up here in front, and if you want to queue up, I'll ask the first question, but then we'll probably jump right to your questions. We do ask that at the Cambridge Forum that it be a question and not a lengthy statement of your own opinion. In the late 1990s, you were a pretty lonely voice trying to alert Americans to the threat that Osama bin Laden and the terrorist network presented. Could you tell us a bit more why you think that it takes a 9/11 to get the media to cover international terrorism, why it takes a Katrina to get the media to focus on poverty? If the media are going to be our watchdog, how do we get them ahead of the curve and moving things along before they happen?
It's a really good question, because I think that we do tend to fight the last war. I recall after the 1984 campaign, we all said, well, we were captivated by the Reagan photo opportunities, and in the next campaign, we're not going to cover pictures. We're going to talk about budget deficits. And, we geniuses in the White House press corps didn't uncover Iran-Contra. We were notified of it by Ed Meese, the Attorney General. So by 1988, we said we were going to cover substance and ignore the photo opportunities. And then Michael Dukakis climbed into an M1 tank and put a helmet on and looked sort of like Snoopy. And it was an image that the late Lee Atwater, working for Bush 41, as he's now called, immediately seized upon as the emblem of what they hoped would be the failed Dukakis campaign, and we couldn't resist it. That same day, it has not been long noted, I write in the book, that Dukakis had given a really serious foreign policy and defense speech in Chicago before going to that factory and climbing into the tank, and of course no one in the media covered the defense speech, which is a long way to say that we tend to be behind the curve. And I think in particular, you know, the administration, the Clinton administration, a top official, as I shared in the book, a top Clinton official, after the 1993 bin Laden attack on the World Trade Center, the first one, said, we dodged a bullet because the building didn't come down and there were fewer casualties than had been feared or might have been feared. And they immediately focused on other things. And we did also. So you're right. It's our job, not theirs, the administration's, not the politicians. It's their job, too. But if we are representing the public as the Fourth Estate, we have an even greater responsibility to be forward-leaning and to be smart and to stick to these sometimes unpleasant subjects. And I think that we sometimes tend to follow the public's mood rather than leading. And if there is a tendency toward more lighthearted or happy talk or feature coverage, not any longer, not since 9/11, but certainly before, I think that that is the path of least resistance in the search, the ever-ending search for ratings. I've been proud of my network in the last few years, and this is not to say that we didn't do some, really good work. And I went to Afghanistan in 1998 and reported on the women under the Taliban. I mean, we all try things, but they are expensive, and during hard times, there's a tendency to do less expensive foreign coverage. So for all of those reasons, I think that we missed a beat with tragic consequences.
We're talking with Andrea Mitchell about talking back. When you have your question, could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Richie Tiemann. You spoke of self-censorship in your opening remarks. I'd like to talk about the kid gloves treatment given Cindy Sheehan. She gave an interview to Mark Knoller recently in which she described the terrorists as freedom fighters. Now, John Leo looked into this and found out that Knoller did not use that quote because it didn't interest him. Very interesting. Well, John Leo.
Just a question, not a statement.
I'll be brief. Sure. John Leo has done a computer check of the New York Times and found out that some of these juicy Cindy Sheehan asinine remarks, most of them, virtually all of them, never made it into the New York Times.
I think we get your point,
well,
sir.
Let me
respond.
Point
can be extremely strengthened by some of these
Well, no, let me respond to you because I know where you're going with this. And Mark Knoller of CBS is a really terrific White House correspondent. But I have to tell you that the editorial process, Cindy Sheehan was there 24/7 for many days. Now, of course, is in Washington protesting. And everything that she says is not going to be quoted. But a lot that she says has been quoted. And I would doubt that that brief excerpt that you refer to reflects everything that Mark Knoller, who was in Texas for a full month, said or wrote about Cindy Sheehan. I think that there's been coverage on both sides, frankly, of Cindy Sheehan. I think you have to honor families who have suffered such losses. She has now become a political activist, and you have to question her and not question her motives so much as question her assertions. And if she did say that, I think that should have been reported, and I'm not sure it wasn't reported.
I'm not allowed to follow up.
If you can ask it in the form of a brief question, you may.
Please.
I'd love to give you these examples. It's devastating that the New York Times chose not in its reportage to run a single one of these quotations that we've had to get elsewhere, from perhaps Fox, from the bloggers, from right-wingers, but big media doesn't want to tell us that Cindy Sheehan refers to Bush.
Sir, is there a question?
If you're not going to let me finish, I give up.
Well, I take your point that anything that we do does require choosing among what to report on any given day. And having not been in Texas, I don't feel fully qualified to accurately reflect everything that Cindy Sheehan has said over the course of these many months. Yes, sir.
It's Jeff Quinlan. I recall a time several years ago when the press corps used to do a good deal more investigative journalism and ask incisive questions and so forth. And I've noticed in recent years the decline of the follow-up question in the White House in particular. And I remember a day when Sam Donaldson was, in fact, famous for, after Reagan would finish a rambling answer, and Sam Donaldson would say, Mr. President, you haven't answered my question, and he would ask it again. Donald Rumsfeld, Karl Rove, Vice President Cheney, President Bush have instituted the one-question rule. Whatever happened to the follow-up question?
Well, it's been the rule at the White House, not at the Pentagon, because Don Rumsfeld does answer follow-up questions at his briefings, but it's been the rule at the White House that this president will not take follow-up questions. We used to, most famously with Helen Thomas, and of course Sam, and I practiced the art myself, we used to pretty regularly frame questions and follow-ups that were not necessarily follow-ups. And of course, it was always the opportunity to get another question into the president. We see these presidents very rarely, and this one in particular, and certainly Ronald Reagan, did not have many press conferences. So it was one of the reasons why, in a section I refer to as designated shouter, my job as a junior correspondent at the White House in the Reagan years when I first got there was to shout questions as the president as he went to the helicopter. Not very dignified. My mother saw me doing it one day. It even was excerpted once on Murphy Brown as a sort of early slice of life of reality television. But I would at times even get on my hands and knees under the camera because I am a little bit challenged in terms of physical stature, and I couldn't stand behind the cameras as most of the men did. So I would crawl under the tripod and shout questions from a sort of semi-prone position so that the president could see me. So we used to be much more aggressive, you're right. But let me just question one thing that you said, because I think we are now doing more investigative journalism than ever before. We now have a very large investigative unit. My colleague Lisa Myers is on the air just about every night with an extraordinary amount of material and has exposed a large number of issues. So in the sense of really digging into tough subjects, we are doing that and doing it at tremendous expense, more so than we ever used to. At least we at NBC and our colleagues at ABC are doing it as well. It's, I think, a response to a lot of the things that did happen 4 years ago.
And to follow up,
please. I knew you would.
Why did you allow that to happen? Why did you allow the president and the White House to limit the press to asking one question? Because as we've seen, this can certainly give them an opportunity to speak sometimes in opposition
Exactly.
or, not speak directly to the question. Why did you allow that to happen?
They write the rules, and the press corps has gone along with the rules. It's their White House. And I'm not a member of that press corps right now, but I have noticed what you're noticing as well, that they don't have nearly as many opportunities as we used to have to ask questions of the president. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Jim Thornton. I would like to ask you a question, too, that relates back perhaps to the issue of self-censorship, which I think a lot of people are concerned about. And I'd like to refer to a couple of brief passages in your book that may illuminate that a little bit. All right, towards the end of the book, you say, quote, unquote, phrases did creep into my reports. This was in you were apparently attempting to rationalize the complacent attitude of the press, including your own reporting in the run-up to America's illegal invasion of Iraq. And you say that phrases did creep into my reports that sounded like an endorsement of the Secretary's, that is Powell's, weapons argument. Again, I relied on sources, not only David Kay, but other former weapons inspectors and dissidents within the State Department to take the official assumptions, to test the official assumptions. This was a case, however, where the established wisdom overshadowed, which is a very ambiguous term, the critics. Okay, now in another passage, very brief one.
What's the question then?
Okay, the question is, I just want to read one other brief passage. Even Washington pauses during the Christmas season on Saturday, December 13th. Alan and I were going to a holiday party at the Rumsfelds. And at the Rumsfelds, everyone seemed especially jolly. This is just after they dropped fragmentation bombs on the Iraqi civilian population. Are you afraid that if in your reporting phrases don't creep into your reports where the established wisdom overshadows the critics, you won't be invited back to cocktail parties or rummies?
Being invited places has nothing to do with what we are reporting. What I am reporting, and what I tried, I think very honestly in talking back to do, is to investigate why conventional wisdom was wrong and why we weren't able to penetrate the intelligence community. Let me finish. And you, a little bit out of context, refer to one of the anecdotes that I write about, which is how reporters and people in official roles in government, when they socialize, have to observe very clear lines. And there were questions about that. That particular evening, my husband knew that Saddam Hussein had been captured but didn't share that information with me. And I included that anecdote to show that there are potential conflicts and that, in fact, that night I was awakened at 5 in the morning by NBC telling me that there was an Iranian report that Saddam Hussein had been captured, and I turned to him and said, "Is that what you were all discussing last night?" And he said, "Don't ask me that question." So I got up and started calling sources in the government to confirm that Saddam Hussein had been captured so that I could go on the air about 15 minutes later with Tom Brokaw. What I think that illustrates is that it is possible for people, for Alan in particular, to keep secrets, and that I don't share in those secrets, and that we have worked around the issue of my being married to a public official. If he had been in government, I would never have met him and we never would have married, but we had been dating for many years before he got that job.
Okay, but you were around, like a lot of us, during the Vietnam era.
This
and
could
you
be a
should have
question
learned
or a
that
statement.
idea about the tragic mistake at that time, shouldn't you? Why should you be so credulous this time about government reports and about the ambiguous evidence that was presented? McNamara, just like Powell.
Sir, I think you're violating.
Is that a valid excuse?
I don't think there are valid excuses, except I think there are more contextual explanations for a lot of things that happen, and there are a lot of people who still believe that this is a valid war. So I don't accept your presumption. I think the way the war is being executed, if you will, in the field, raises a lot of questions. And we are doing our very best. We have lost more reporters covering this war than any previous war.
How many civilians have been lost? Kofi Annan says it's a illegal war. Do you accept that?
I think this is not the place to debate the legality or illegality of the war in Iraq. Yes, ma'am.
I have a perhaps softer question, not an angry question, but my name is Jennifer Brown Parker, and I'm a Canadian journalist in Washington. I'm here for an open house at Harvard for the Harvard School of Government. I just wanted to ask you, what is your impression of the role that perhaps patriotism or nationalism played in the lead up to the Iraq War?
I was suggesting that, and it's a good question, because I think that there was an inevitable and somewhat understandable reaction that was patriotic or rally around the flag, and that, I think, contributed to what I've sort of broadly defined as self-censorship. I think there was a reluctance to take on the administration, and also a sense, there was a shock to our system as well. We are citizens and Americans, most of us, before we are journalists. In the case of NBC, we also had suffered through the anthrax attack, and people didn't even know the extent that that had affected my colleagues working in those same offices. There are after effects to this day, and they've never found the culprit or culprits. So we were all pretty shaken, especially the people living in New York and Washington, and certainly the citizens in Pennsylvania. The day of 9/11, I was trying to cope with, the reaction. We were all sort of in automatic mode, trying to get through it and working on the broadcast and both of our cable networks with different, not simultaneous newscasts. And it took about a half hour before I realized that my husband was flying toward Dulles at that moment from Zurich. And as I write in the book, for hours, in the initial couple of hours, they were trying to figure out how broad was the conspiracy and whether there were other planes that had been hijacked, and they were cataloging how many had been and landing planes as quickly as possible, and all of the overseas flights were being landed in Canada, and still I hadn't heard from him. So we were on the air nonstop. At a few minutes before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was sitting down at the anchor desk in Washington to do an update with Tom Brokaw anchoring in New York. And just as he was about to come to me, my cell phone rang. And it was Alan, back in Zurich. They had turned the plane around. They'd run out of landing space in Canada, turned the plane around, and had gone all the way back across the Atlantic. And he's saying, "What is going on in America?" And in my ear, I heard the director say, "Are you ready? Are you ready? Tom's just to come to you." And so all I could say was, "Listen up." And I put the cell phone in my lap and did an update for Tom, broadcasting what had happened, and that's how my husband, learned all the details about 9/11. So, I mean, we're all human beings first, primarily, which is not an excuse, but I do think that led to, especially with the war in Afghanistan first and then the plans to take on Saddam Hussein, I think that muted some of what would have otherwise been more challenging questions.
Hi, my name is Henry Turner, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on the decline of foreign reporting, and particularly in Sudan and in Africa.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I think one of the areas that we spend the least amount of time on is the whole area of Africa. Bill Clinton has said that the greatest tragedy of his presidency was his failure to respond sooner to Rwanda. And it wasn't until a BBC correspondent and film crew went to Rwanda that the rest of the world became concerned and aware. I mean, if it's possible to ignore genocide, we did. And so we've seen the same thing happen in Darfur. And it's, first of all, difficult. It's very difficult to send people into the field. And it was all happening at the same time as Iraq and everything else that was of greater concern domestically, and, of course, the Middle East, the Intifada, the Second Intifada. And I think there is, frankly, a bias in decision-making in the established mainstream media. And the bias, if anything, is toward easier, more accessible stories. It's one of the reasons I argue so strongly for more diversity in the media, because if you have, frankly, mostly white men of middle class or better background making the decisions about what is newsworthy, you'll find that their choices tend to reflect their own backgrounds. And so if we don't have more diversity in the producing and editing levels, the higher levels of network television, for instance, or our newspapers, deciding what stories should be covered, when to launch a correspondent and camera crew, which costs thousands and thousands of dollars to a place like Darfur. And it's also very dangerous. We've suffered some losses, as I alluded to, in Iraq. We lost David Bloom, and his death was a medical issue, but it stemmed directly from his being in cramped quarters for 3 weeks on the March on Baghdad. So we lost a valued friend and colleague, and it has shattered us to have lost other people in Iraq, and we've seen now the toll on the Iraqi colleagues, the Iraqi nationals, whom all of the networks and the newspapers have hired, and the New York Times people and the CBS people who have been jailed and murdered. And so it just is so expensive and complicated that I think business executives at networks such as ours think long and hard before sending people to a place like Darfur when the State Department says, don't go. It's too dangerous. So those are a number of the reasons why I think we don't do enough. What I am looking forward to is when I go back after traveling the country with this book is going back and arguing strongly for more coverage of Africa.
Good evening. Michael Bronner, Cambridge resident. I just wanted to know about what your experience was during the 2000 election when they were calling states and not calling states, and kind of what went on in the newsroom. And a second question is, it's kind of a little bit less controversial, is what's your professional opinion on Bill O'Reilly?
That's less controversial, right? Bill O'Reilly is a very popular, very effective broadcaster. He's obviously controversial. He comes out of Boston, so he may be more familiar to those of you in the local level here than those of us who have seen him as a phenomenon on the national level, but he has certainly changed the nature of cable talk, and does it in a very provocative way. As to what was happening in 2000, it was interesting. That night, I was covering Hillary Clinton's Senate race. And so having covered the whole campaign, that night I was assigned to her, and I was back from her victory statements. One of the things that I describe in the book is how I was at her hotel where she was having her big rally, and worked my way across the crowd, got to the foot of the stage, and was hoping to get a question to her or Bill Clinton, was at her side, and Clinton leaned down to me and said, "How is Al doing?" Because Florida had been declared for Al Gore, and then it was taken back during that period when Hillary was making her victory speech. And I figured, my God, if you don't know, based on the reporting you're getting from the Democratic organization in the field, then we really are in trouble at the network level, which is what it proved to be. And it proved, in fact, that Jeb Bush's information was more real time than what the president, the head of the Democratic Party, was getting. But as to, I think, the heart of your question, which is how did we screw it up so bad, it was a mess. And as Brokaw said that night, we not only have, egg on our face, we have a whole omelet on our face. We were wrong how many times that night? It was based on wrong data that came from the pooled vote counting and exit poll information that all the networks, the Associated Press, and the newspapers all share. They all had a bad model, and we all pay for that. The whole service was changed, after that. But 4 years later, what you saw was we even didn't declare Ohio after we knew what Ohio was going to do, even after the Kerry people were saying Ohio would not end up in a recount, because we wanted to wait to make absolutely sure we didn't make the same mistake twice. And obviously the Declaration of Ohio determined what happened in 2004. It was a total breakdown, and it didn't result from any partisan political influence. It resulted from, oh my God, what are we going to do? They're declaring it. Well, we're behind, and each network has its own election unit, and are we misreading the data? Well, if they got it this way, then it must be true, and we were all taking, the same bad information.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good evening. My name is Moban Chokmantin. I am a Thai reporter. I'm studying at Simmons College in Communications Management. I have two simple questions. Do you have any questions that you want to ask but you never ask or cannot ask?
I think there were no bad questions. There were bad answers, but there were no bad questions. I think if you ask a question politely enough, with respect for the office, that if you think it's newsworthy, my colleague David Gregory asked the president on Friday whether he was heading back down to Texas in the hurricane zone, whether his going would get in the way of the rescue operations. And that was not taken very kindly by the president, I don't think, but I think it was a perfectly legitimate question, whether or not when you arrive in a big blue and white plane with Secret Service and closing the airspace and lots of advanced people, you're going to prevent the people on the ground from doing the job they need to do. And in fact, because the hurricane didn't hit where it was expected, they ended up not going to San Antonio with the president, because the San Antonio relief and rescue teams needed to move on to the next location and couldn't wait around for a photo opportunity. So they ended up canceling that trip only a few hours later. So I think there are no bad questions, and that, if anything, we should ask questions more aggressively.
Okay, and next question is, what is the most important thing that has helped you succeed as a woman journalist?
I think being pushy and tough, and at times not making friends. I mean, there were times when I've asked and done things and pushed my way into the front row so that I could ask a question, and it doesn't go over so well with colleagues or with the people I cover. But I think you have to just not be shy about that, and it's not a popularity contest. That said, it also means trying to develop a thick skin. And when you fail, and when we fail, it is very public and very humiliating. There's a time I write about in 1988, in Thanksgiving weekend 88, when I thought I was going to be promoted to be chief White House correspondent, instead got transferred to Capitol Hill to cover Congress. And I was devastated. I mean, I broke down and cried in front of the whole White House press corps that day. And in fact, it turned out to be the best change I could have ever had. I got out of the White House bubble. I went to cover Congress. It's a chapter in the book called Scandal on the Hill. There was a scandal a minute. I mean, the Speaker of the House was forced out. The John Tower didn't get confirmed. The savings and loan scandal, the Keating Five, the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings, which were, profoundly transformative in terms of a real discussion. No matter what happened, we at least had a public discussion in a way that Americans had not in decades, of both race and gender issues, sexual harassment in the workplace. So there were so many questions: gun control, the Brady Act, the Americans for Disability Action, budget crises. I had learned so much from covering Congress. I'd always covered it tangentially as part of my White House beat, reaching out to members of Congress, but getting there and really digging in was a great moment of growth for me. So with every setback as a woman, and certainly as a minority, something I have not experienced, but I think you have to be able to pick yourself up and brush yourself off, and it sounds like a cliche, but go on to the next thing and embrace opportunities, even if you think they're not what you wanted. I've really learned over the course of this career that each new assignment turned out to be better than the last, and I never realized that would be the case. So it's really a joyful experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
Hello, my name is Robert Chu. My question is about 9/11. Everyone has seen pictures, of course, as the planes came into the towers. And it seems so obvious that the towers imploded, and that an airplane going in at such a high level could not have possibly caused an implosion, which we've all seen, initiated destruction of buildings. So, and notwithstanding the 9/11 Commission report, this is a major question. How could this not be opened and questioned? That the planes
well, in fact, I mean, I've read the reports, and I've read other engineering studies and architectural studies, and everything that I've read, and I am not an expert in this field, certainly not a construction engineer, but everything that I've read supports the argument that this is one of the great flaws in our system, that in fact the buildings were not built to withstand terror, or not reinforced, that they were vulnerable, and that other structures are vulnerable. And I've seen many descriptions that support the argument that the planes, having hit exactly where they hit, did lead to the implosion of the building. So I have no scientific basis to agree with your concerns, but surely this has been examined and will be re-examined as they continue to debate how to replace the towers.
We have about 10 10 minutes
Thank
left.
Thank you.
So I think if we can keep the questions tight, we can probably get to the four of you that are still in line.
Hi, my name is Emily Whip. I'm a student at Wellesley, and I just actually had a question about the effects of the imprisonment of the New York Times' Judith Miller. I was just wondering if you've seen an effect or how this has affected journalists now, and also do you think she was rightly punished?
I think it's an outrage that Judith Miller is in prison for a story she did not write, or for any story for that matter. I am mystified as to how this could have happened. I think it argues strongly, even though we're not popular, we journalists, strongly for a national shield law. There has been a chilling effect, and it's been on any potential whistleblowers in the administration, because now it's very clear that anyone who talks to reporters, especially in the national security field, will be recorded, or names will be taken. People are not supposed to, talk. The unwitting effect of all of this has been that fewer people will be willing to share information from inside the administration. Presumably this independent counsel is following the book as he always has. He has a very good reputation. And so presumably he is pursuing a case that will lead to charges being filed against someone other than Judith Miller. The case law itself, the statute under which this whole investigation was launched, involves whether a public official, not a reporter, knowingly reveals the identity of a covert operative. And it has to be an official at a certain level. There has to be motivation. It has to be a witting act. It can't be some public official accidentally or unwittingly disclosing the identity of someone without realizing what the effect will be. So it is a very, very difficult statute to prove. Very few lawyers whom I've talked to think that there is any chance at all that anyone will be indicted under that statute. That means, presumably, that he is going after someone in office for perjury or obstruction of justice or some conspiracy count. We're expecting that it will happen very soon. I am really hoping that Judy Miller gets out soon and that they don't convert her contempt into a far more serious conviction for criminal contempt, and I hope that they don't extend this grand jury. But I think it's a daily outrage that this has happened. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Douglas Ruska, and hearkening back to your comments on Bill Clinton in Rwanda, where it was a BBC reporter who had introduced some video evidence, do you feel that the in-depth print-based reporting has lost its power to shape public opinion, where people are so much more easily swayed by video and less in-depth and more immediate forms?
There were print reporters who were there, and right now there's a correspondent for the Washington Post, for instance, who has been in Darfur throughout and is doing extraordinary reporting. But it is true, it's true that if the major newspapers, the obvious national newspapers, report something, that they drive the agenda. We end up reporting, things that were in the Boston Globe or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. We do follow their leads very often. There's an inferiority complex, if you will, that television has always had about print. So print has a huge impact, and a bigger one now with the web and the fact that everyone nationally can read print stories online. That said, the visual impact of what was going on in Rwanda is so powerful that sometimes it takes television or documentary evidence, which was the case, with some of the reporting out of Sarajevo, which was film work. Sometimes it takes the visual power to awaken the American public to something like that seems so alien and so foreign. But it's a mix. Print is still a very powerful medium, and it is a lot cheaper for print reporters to go over with a laptop and file than for an entire television crew to be housed in some of these places and using satellites and all the rest. So it is a budget consideration, among other things.
Do you see that changing with the advent of video?
Excuse me, we only have 5 minutes.
Yes, I think satellite phones and video phones is making it a lot easier to get around the world, and we're doing better at that.
Rebecca de Vives from Chile. Andrea, this is a little bit of a personal question, but how much was objectivism a discussion between you and Alan? And if so, how much did that impact you in your daily life?
It has not. You're referring to the fact that he is known to have been an acquaintance of Ayn Rand and of the objectivists in the early 50s, long before I knew him. My knowledge of Ayn Rand was to read her novels when I was in high school. In particular, when I was babysitting, I used to love the fact that I could buy time to read the novels, novels that we didn't always have at our house. So I used to sort of love the heroic female figures like Dagny Taggart and all in Ayn Rand's novels. I wasn't really reading the philosophy so much as the storytelling. But no, in fact, it has not been part of our lives. I think that he's in a very different stage of his life right now, and it's not, I think it's probably something that has evolved over the years.
Thank you.
Surely.
Hi, my name's David Reno. I came in late, so you may have answered this question. We now have something called embedded reporters who are embedded as foreign correspondents. Now, we have always had foreign correspondents in America, at least since the Civil War. I would like to know how the current notion of, quote, embedding people, whatever that may mean, would have varied from, say, the reporting that was done by Ernie Pyle during World War II. I understand during World War II they submitted their things for censorship so as not to identify troops or movements. Is there a conflict in becoming part of the Army and hence a part of the propaganda machine as opposed to being an objective reporter as to saying what is there?
It's a very good question. The embedded reporters was an innovation that was conceived by the Pentagon, particularly by Tori Clark, who was a woman, Victoria Clark, working for Don Rumsfeld at the time. And it was in response partly to our many, many complaints about the first Gulf War and the Panama invasion, and certainly Grenada, when we were kept out. In the first Gulf War, we had to operate in pools, and when we tried to go out on our own, sometimes we were arrested and stopped by the military, and we never got to see anything. So it was a way to get with the invading army, to be on the front lines, to do it in real time, to broadcast live. And in some ways it worked. Obviously it was dramatic, but it needs to be put in the context, and you raise some serious questions appropriately, that the drama, the power of those visuals from the march across the desert certainly overwhelmed the context in which they were reported. In our case at NBC, and I have to tell you that we were working so much round the clock, I didn't see all of the other networks as I usually try to do. But in our case, we had our armchair generals, Barry McCaffrey, who was frequently challenging the Pentagon's policy, and Monty Miggs and others who were academics and who have long, thought long and hard about these issues, who were criticizing the deployment, in fact, early on for being too small and not being well planned. So they were trying to create the context for what we were seeing from the invading troops. And I think it's the same problem we experienced with perhaps our coverage of Ronald Reagan. We might write a story that the president was campaigning and trying to claim that he was going to cut taxes and increase defense spending and balance the budget all at the same time, and it was obvious this couldn't be done, and here's an expert saying it's ridiculous. Yet what people, from our own studies, what people took from that campaign were these happy images of Ronald Reagan and weren't listening to any of the challenging things we were reporting. So this may turn out to have been a similar instance where what we were seeing from the embedded reporters overwhelmed the context from the studio. That said, there were plenty of instances where the embedded reporters, and since in Fallujah and elsewhere, have reported facts that the American people needed to know, facts that the Pentagon was not at all happy with. And we were not censored as long as we didn't report, specific troop movements and locations. So it was better than not being there. I think we got more ground truth than we would have had otherwise. But you're right. They have to, it's completely human nature that they would absorb the mentality of the people who were protecting them and helping them travel and become one of the infantry themselves, let's say, if they were with the infantry. Not in every case, but certainly in the most exposed cases on the front lines, it's a natural instinct. And I don't say that critically because I have to tell you that the valor of some of the people who, my friends and colleagues who are working in really difficult circumstances, was extraordinary. Shirley.
This will be the last question. It'll have to be short, please.
My question is this. You mentioned your regret at the lack of coverage of Africa.
Could you just step closer to the microphone, ma'am? Thank you.
You mentioned your regret at the lack of coverage of Africa, but I wonder what local, what national issues do you think have not been covered adequately by the press, or what do you think the media can do to sort of raise the level of political discourse, which I think many of us feel has declined over the last years?
Well, in fact, in talking back, I traced some of that to the beginning of the popularity of talk TV and radio, which synergistically with the rise of more aggressive Republican House members, because they were in the minority and they had been really shut down by the Democratic leadership for years. So when Newt Gingrich came into power and really started to challenge people, and at the same time the money chase led some of our best senators to retire, I think prematurely, from the Senate, that opened up vacancies where House members were the logical candidates to run for the Senate, and they didn't have the culture or the history of the Senate. They were far more partisan and aggressive. And I think what talk television does is put a premium on partisanship, on provocative sound bites, on edginess, if you will, and not on civil discourse. And then we've just had some terrible losses. The loss of Pat Moynihan, the only real scholar in the Senate. Candidates who can campaign in television, made-for-television events, or not hold news conferences and not participate in debates and get anointed because they've got more money to spend on advertising, or they've got these special interest groups working, behind the scenes for them. There's just been a confluence of events that have led to the decline in political discourse. And finally, and it's certainly not the case of this audience or people here in Massachusetts where politics is an art form, but finally there are people who just don't vote and don't care and don't follow it. And it's not only us not communicating, it's people not being out there who care about politics, and a whole new generation that disdains politics. So it's sort of a vicious circle, and it's one reason I wrote the book, one reason why I want to go speak about the book and about just how we can engage this next generation more in both journalism and politics. So thank you for asking that.
Andrea Mitchell, thank you.
Thank you.